So, as soon as things start going well, the dismissive avoidant attachment style, and you get closer and more connected, suddenly they pull away out of nowhere. And you're left wondering, why did they leave when things were suddenly going better than they ever have? Well, there are some crucial reasons to understand why avoidants tend to leave as soon as things start going well, and what it actually means about you and the future of your connection. So, before we dive into really what you can do about this and what you really need to understand in order to improve the quality of your relationship, I want to just give you some context about the dismissive avoidance childhood as a whole so you can understand what these deep mechanics are that cause them to leave relationships and suddenly pull away in their adult lives. And the first thing you need to understand here is that the dismissive avoidant, as a child, grows up in a household where their parents or caregivers are emotionally unavailable. In other words, when a child comes into the world, a child is biologically wired for attunement. In other words, they need that deep sense of undivided attention, of presence, and of connection. But the dismissive avoidance childhood often has a lack of that. Usually, one or both caregivers are emotionally unavailable. They are not good at being present. They are too much in their head. They're too busy with other things and other priorities. Perhaps there's too many kids in the household. But for whatever number of reasons, they grow up in a household where they don't really get that sense of undivided attention that they're needing. Yet, because children are literally wired for this attention, this is hurtful to the dismissive avoidant. It doesn't feel good. And so, what ends up happening is we always, as individuals, tend to adapt to painful circumstances over time. And children are especially adaptive as a general rule. And so, what happens is this young child grows up feeling pain to a certain degree in their vulnerability, in their yearning for the love, care, and affection from their caregivers. And what happens is when they cannot seem to get this need met, eventually they adapt by saying, I'm just not going to need this at all. And they reject others and take more space from others as a subconscious strategy to essentially create relief for themselves. And over time, it actually works. But this causes them to become afraid as adults of ever being that vulnerable again. And in fact, because they have positive emotional associations tied into holding back their feelings, holding back needing to rely on other people, essentially what that does is as adults, they're like, I'm not willing to let my guard down because I've been there before and it doesn't feel good. So we will see that the dismissive avoidant has these deep rooted fears that are essentially about lowering their guard, letting people in, being vulnerable, being in a space where they have an intimate connection with somebody else. And because of this, as adults, they keep believing that their vulnerability will only result in negative outcomes like they felt in their childhood experiences. Now, on top of this, dismissive avoidant attachment styles will end up using flaw finding as a protective mechanism. In other words, when the connection gets real, usually you'll see dismissive avoidance start off in dating, and for the first 6 weeks or the first couple months, things go smoothly. They can show up quite well because there isn't this deep attachment bond being built yet. But when that attachment bond starts to be built, when that vulnerability gets more real, when they start to develop deeper feelings, this is where their different attachment style dynamics will tend to arise. And so usually 6 weeks, 2 months or so in, you'll see that the dismissive avoidance starts pulling back. And flaw finding essentially becomes their protection mechanism. They try to look for flaws in the other person to justify and validate to themselves that they don't need somebody else. And they're really doing this, and the relationship to it at a deeper subconscious level is that doing this makes them feel safe, makes them have to not relive their painful childhood experiences. So things often start off really well with this dismissive avoidant attachment style, but then we have 4 big things that will come up for the dismissive avoidant. And these 4 things are really what cause them to leave a good relationship. Number 1, the fear of intimacy, right? All those fears of intimacy, because intimacy is about vulnerability, right? Intimacy is about letting somebody in, letting somebody see you, learning to rely on somebody else. And that's part of what develops this bond of closeness. And so this fear of intimacy will start causing the dismissive avoidant to pull back. And it's not about the person. It's about their inner subconscious fear and program that they adopted from their childhood experiences. Number 2, fear of commitment. Dismissive avoidance often would say to me when I was in my private practice, they would say, I'm terrified of ending up with the wrong person. And again, what this really is often about at a much deeper level is a fear of being in a situation like they were in childhood where they needed something from somebody. They needed love, they needed connection and care and attention, and they couldn't get it. And so really the fear of commitment at a much deeper level, it goes right back to those initial pain points, which is this fear of being in a committed relationship with somebody and them not being able to show up and meet their individual needs, and them feeling lost, feeling sad, and feeling essentially to some degree trapped as a result. Number 3, dismissive avoidants often don't know how to do vulnerability in a healthy way. Dismissive avoidants have often said things to me like, I would like to be vulnerable, but I don't even know what that looks like. And you have to remember the vast majority of dismissive avoidants built their attachment style at a very young age in their childhood, and it had been decades since they even felt that degree of vulnerability. And so that becomes a practice where they have to, over time, start practicing opening up more, communicating, sharing their needs, and more. And then number 4, unrealistic expectations. Dismissive avoidants often, because they struggle to work through conflict with other people, they struggle to hash things out, communicate about their needs, hear somebody else's needs, and they sometimes struggle to want to compromise with other people because they haven't been modeled the types of relationships where you make compromises. They have been modeled the types of relationships where everybody just kind of meets their own needs, and that's that. So they often end up thinking, well, for somebody to be in a relationship with me, we have to be a perfect fit. But when somebody says things have to be perfect, or they have these sort of extreme expectations about how a relationship should go and how people should show up, usually underneath that, it's actually because they have a deep sense of learned helplessness around resolving differences. In other words, they feel really disempowered to work things out when there are differences. But one of the important things to note about relationships is that we will always have differences. That's the beauty. We get to learn and grow through understanding and making healthy space for each other's needs and differences. And so in order to do that, we have to be good at communicating and working conflict through. So now that you understand some of this, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what you can do if you are in this relationship dynamic. If you now see very clearly, okay, this is why the avoidant leaves the relationship. It's their deep childhood subconscious wounds and fears. Those are the 4 big things that they are and exist within: the fear of commitment, fear of intimacy, fear of vulnerability, and don't know how to be vulnerable, and then those unrealistic expectations. Well, what can we do about that? Well, all of those things actually get worked through as we learn to become good communicators. I have historically and consistently found in my practice working with many dismissive avoidant clients that what ended up allowing them to really be able to move into a healthy space in their relationships is when they learned to slowly but surely, really like incrementally through exposure work, open themselves up, share their fears with their partner, share their needs with their partner, have a partner who encourages them consistently to communicate their needs, that reminds them to communicate their needs. Because then what happens is dismissive avoidants through communication learn that, hey, intimacy is actually healthy. Being seen actually helps me get my needs met. That allows me to feel safer committing to other people. And it also allows me to not feel trapped, because people often at a subconscious level also feel trapped because they're not communicating their needs. And so it feels like you're just left in a relationship to whatever the outcome's going to be. And it feels like you have very little control over that outcome if you don't know how to communicate about what outcome you want to see. And then also, communication encourages vulnerability and helps us work through our expectations by converting expectations into needs instead. You know, when we have an expectation, for example, that our partner should do the dishes more, well, we can actually make that a solvable problem by turning that into a need. Hey, I need some support. Could you take a turn doing the dishes? So when we foster healthy communication, this actually helps the needle move dramatically in a relationship with a dismissive avoidant, both as the dismissive avoidant learns to be a better communicator and understand themselves and their needs, but also as each individual partner can do that in the collective. So if you want to do a deeper dive into this, I actually have a course all about this called How to Repair Any Relationship. You can actually check it out completely for free for 7 days using the link in the description box below for a limited time. That won't be there forever. So check that out. And that is it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you're enjoying this channel, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And I look forward to seeing you in future videos.